But first, promising to rewire the nation and focus on public services and the cost of living. The UK's seventh Prime Minister in a decade is getting ready to move into number 10 Downing Street. The former Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has promised to rapidly raise living standards. Outgoing Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has travelled from Downing Street to Buckingham Palace to formally tell King Charles that he is indeed resigning. And after that, Andy Burnham is expected to go to the palace and the monarch will ask him to form a government. Let's take a listen to what Sir Keir Starmer said earlier.
My work is done. In 6.5 years, I took our party from a historic defeat in 2019, changed it so it was fit to face the country, and won a landslide general election victory in 2024. Since then, it has been the privilege of my life to serve you and this great country as Prime Minister. And I am confident that Britain is now stronger and fairer than it was 2 years ago.
And with me in the studio is our International Affairs Editor, Rochelle Ferguson, who watched that speech. First of all, let's talk about Keir Starmer and the fact what he had to say in his speech there. I mean, he definitely gave a very positive spin to a very troubled 2-year political reign, didn't he?
Well, absolutely. We went through that landslide victory to which he made reference during that speech, that, Labour making this historic defeat, riding high in terms of the votes and the trust that it had from the British people to, 2 years later, a very different tune, a Keir Starmer who didn't necessarily want to step down. If you remember, with the early echoes within the Labour Party, Keir Starmer was absolutely firm and said, no, I will remain British Prime Minister until it became untenable, until there were more and more voices within the Labour Party asking for him to step down. Think of somebody like Wes Streeting, who we thought initially might stand for the role, and then in the end decided to step aside and let Andy Burnham go forward. But I mean, Keir Starmer left with a speech there that, as you say, must have been a difficult one. It was certainly an emotional one, even if, he doesn't always show his emotions. And perhaps that's one of the things that, he'd been criticised for in the past. He certainly doesn't wear his heart on his sleeve. But he reminded the British public of what he's done for the country. These waiting times in the NHS, which have significantly reduced under Keir Starmer. Also, the international reputation of the United Kingdom, of course. If you look at Ukraine, for example, and this kind of relationship that he's managed to build with the Ukrainian president, and the optics of Britain on that stage. And he also made the fact clear that the economy is stronger, certainly in his view, and there's a stronger, fairer, better Britain with public services. So he wanted to go, but he wanted to remind us of his legacy, if you will, a legacy that was repeated on Friday by Andy Burnham, who thanked Keir Starmer for, handing over the reins. So a difficult moment, an emotional moment, but you might wonder if Keir Starmer doesn't want to also be done with all of this as well and perhaps move on to his next role, whatever that may be.
We're seeing images there, Rochelle, of Andy Burnham arriving at Buckingham Palace. What are Andy Burnham's biggest strengths and political weaknesses as a Prime Minister, do we think?
Well, because we see him going in, that image of him going in to meet the King now for that kissing hands, process, if you will. Obviously, there won't be kissing hands. He will, say that he accepts the role officially as British Prime Minister, and then he will likely shake hands and bow before the King. But I think a lot awaits him. I mean, and I think you could say that of anybody taking over the reins of the UK today in the state that it is, some might say, with, questions of social care. We've spoken a lot about that and the gaps that need to be filled in that. Andy Burnham himself has called the system broken and said that because of his father, who suffers from Alzheimer's, he's more aware than ever of the changes that need to be made to the social care system. There are also other domestic issues like housing. The objective was 1.5 million homes to be constructed in the UK. Only 204,000 were constructed last year. So, there are a lot of domestic issues. That's without without getting into Brexit, which will need to be addressed at some stage. That's without looking at what kind of relationship might he form with the American president. You know, knowing the impulsivity of Donald Trump, it was at times tense between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump. So a lot of dossier that we'd say here in France, a lot of policies to really iron out and make clear for the British public.
Rochelle, stay with us because I'd like to now go to Tim Bale, a professor of politics at Queen Mary University in London. Professor, thank you for your time. Andy Burnham, as Rochelle and I were talking just now, has a tough job ahead. So what will be the biggest political challenges that he's inheriting?
They won't be so very different from the ones that Keir Starmer and his administration tried to tackle. The first one has to be to improve the rate of economic growth in the UK, because that in some ways stands behind all the other problems, particularly with regard to the amount of government borrowing that's going on and the fact that he may have to raise taxes if he wants to improve public services in the way that he's promised, particularly if he wants to do something about social care. Secondly, I think it's clear that he's going to have to do something to signal to the public that this administration, in contrast in some ways to previous administrations, both Tory and Labour, have got a grip on the so-called small boats crisis, people coming across and claiming asylum on dinghies from France. That still remains, at least as far as the public are concerned, a very big issue. It's not an easy one to tackle. I don't think he should make promises that he's going like Rishi Sunak to stop the boats, but at least giving people some sense that, you know, he is getting a grip on the issue, I think is important.
He has been suspiciously quiet about Brexit, though, hasn't he?
Understandably, in some ways, I think many people in the Labour Party, particularly some of its MPs in the North and the Midlands, are in seats where they fear some kind of backlash were the government to move closer to the EU. And certainly if the government were to talk about joining the single market or the customs union, let alone actually rejoining the EU. Having said that, Burnham himself has long been an advocate of closer relationships with the EU. He has talked in the past about rejoining. I don't think that's going to come out in terms of his rhetoric in the next few weeks or months or even the next 2 or 3 years. But we might find in the next parliament, if he's fortunate enough to get re-elected, then some rather more major steps will be made on that front. And to be honest, if you look at the economy, they probably have to be.
Tim, Rochelle here in the studio with Annette. I mean, just off the back of that question about Brexit, Andy Burnham has spoken about, you know, not necessarily wanting to revisit, in any case, straight away this question of Brexit, because he says, you know, strengthening democracy is about accepting the decisions that were made, you know, before he came into power. Do you think that we could see him, you know, making agreements with Brussels the way that we've seen Keir Starmer doing in recent times, and perhaps building on those, you know, this idea of agri agreements, or, you know, food and drink or electricity? Could that be a way for Andy Burnham to address this situation of Brexit without really doing so?
I mean, I think obviously those kind of incremental moves will be the ones that are pursued, because in some ways they don't scare the horses and they possibly make a marginal difference to our economic future. But as any economist will tell you, in some ways they are marginal, and the only big gains are to be made from actually rejoining the single market and, to a lesser extent, the customs union. I mean, I think in terms of the diplomacy, you will see warm words, you will see summits at which agreements are signed, but it's not actually clear that that will make very much difference to the economy. The problem for the UK, of course, is that it's not just a UK decision. It's also an EU decision as to whether they allow us to get closer. Certainly, they're not keen on the UK cherry picking, as they sometimes put it. And to be honest, I think many people in Brussels regard an EU without the UK as a slightly more pleasant place to operate, even if they would actually, for perhaps defence reasons, as well as other diplomatic reasons, and perhaps even for economic reasons, like us back in there.
Professor Bale, at the end of the day, It's the electorate who's going to be the final judge. So do you think Burnham can win over voters who've drifted to Reform UK or to even further right parties such as Restore Britain?
To be honest, that isn't his biggest challenge. The biggest challenge for Andy Burnham is to try and put Labour at the head of the progressive bloc in politics. And here we're talking about Labour, the Greens, and the Liberal Democrats, and also people who have drifted off into non-voting, because there are far more of them than have drifted off to Reform UK, let alone Restore UK. So while there is obviously a lot of media interest in the so-called rise of the populist radical right because it's a European phenomenon, actually Nigel Farage's party seems to have stalled at the moment. And anyway, it doesn't attract as many 2024 voters as do the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and indeed people who have decided not to decide for the moment.
I'm going to have to leave it there. I want to thank my guests, Professor Tim Bale from Queen Mary University in London and our International Affairs Editor, Rochelle Ferguson. Now, for more on this story, let's bring in our business editor, Charles Pellegrin. Andy Burnham is promising tangible improvements in people's lives, but the state of the country's public finances is certainly going to make that a very tough job, isn't it?
Yeah, the former mayor of Greater Manchester coming to power with promises to revive the UK economy and make ordinary Britons' lives better, but at a time when the state does not have much financial room when it comes to spending and investment. According to the UK's Office for Budgetary Responsibility's latest forecast for March 2026, government spending is predicted to outpace receipts once again, extending a run of budget deficits stretching back to more than 2 decades. The fiscal deficit forecast to around 133 billion pounds, so that's just over 156 billion euros. And when it comes to spending, almost 40% of that is dedicated to government expenditures, to day-to-day running of public services, and just about a quarter of that goes on to welfare payments, including pensions and universal credit, which is basically Social Security.
Now, his room for manoeuvre as a result is also very much limited by his own commitments, isn't it, Charles?
Right. The Prime Minister has said he will stick to Labour's manifesto from the 2024 general election, and this really hinders his ability to raise the UK government's main revenue earners, which are the income tax, national insurance, or the value-added tax as well. There's also a commitment to pensioners with the triple lock. This is a guarantee that the government will increase pensions annually in step with either inflation, wage increases, or 2.5%, whichever is highest on the year. And finally, he's committed to former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves' self-imposed fiscal rules, which most of all include a commitment to ensure that day-to-day government spending is funded through tax revenues by the 5th year of the forecast. All of that means there's relatively little room for new spending aimed at improving people's everyday lives, especially when you consider another promise or commitment to ramp up defense spending to 3.5% of GDP by 2035.
Because we're all waiting to see who the Chancellor of the Exchequer will be. But Andy Burnham has outlined a program to stimulate economic growth. Tell me more about that.
Well, the idea is that faster economic growth would generate higher tax revenues, giving the government more money to spend without raising tax rates. The central tenet of Burnham's policy is based on devolution, meaning handing more decision-making power to the local and regional level. This will give them more incentives to engage in pro-growth policies and will also place decision-making with people with better knowledge of local economic realities. There are also quicker ways for Burnham to make a point with regards to his economic policies. There's reporting this Monday saying he will scrap Keir Starmer's national digital ID scheme, which was aimed at tackling illegal immigration, and spend the £600 million a year or so instead on cost of living support. And another piece of reporting suggests that he could also be soon announcing new drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea in spite of a Labour promise to not issue any new licenses for exploration in that area. There are 2 projects, though, called Rosebank and Jackdaw, that have licenses already but have been stalled, so that could give his administration a bit of wiggle room. This could also be a move to placate the UK's crucial ally, the United States, and its President Donald Trump, who have previously severely criticized Keir Starmer for his hindering of developments in the North Sea. This last example really just shows the number of different priorities that Andy Burnham will have to juggle so that as he takes office later today.
Charles Pellegrin, thank you for